Hello and welcome. I'm Jahnavi from The Wire, and with me today is Audrey Truschke. She's assistant professor of South Asian history at Rutgers University, and we're here today and she's going to tell us a little bit about her work and also some recent experiences she's had in India. Just to talk a little bit about your work, one question I've had while reading it is that a lot of it seems to be about dispelling certain popular, well, I wouldn't say popular necessarily, but certain myths about medieval Indian history. Whether that's your book on Aurangzeb, or also when you've talked about the exchange between Persian and Sanskrit scholars in the Mughal court. So, just wanted to ask, what drew you to this kind of history? Why did you think these are certain myths that need to be addressed? Did you mean it like that, or was that something just happened as a byproduct?
So first off, thank you for having me, Jahnavi. It's really my pleasure to be here and talk with you today. So how did I come to choose my topic? So, in some sense, this is an uninteresting story. I became interested in, India-related things in college, and I learned Sanskrit, and then I started learning a little bit of Persian, and sort of when I sat down and thought, okay, I'll go to grad school, because what else are you going to do with Sanskrit and Persian in 21st century America? I thought about what topics, could I use these language skills, and could I use my sort of background in, at that point, largely Hinduism? What could I use all of that to do? And sort of some sort of cross-cultural Hindu-Muslim, Sanskrit-Persian encounters in the Indo-Islamic period made sense, right? It sort of made good use of my skills up until that point. And then as I went on with my studies at Columbia University, where I got my PhD, I sort of narrowed it down, right, to Sanskrit at the Mughal courts of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. Yeah. Now, all of that said, once I sort of became a Sanskritist and a Persianist and a Mughal historian. Then when I thought about writing on Aurangzeb, I think that decision was guided a bit more directly by modern politics and what's going on today. Because nobody exists outside of their own context, right? I am a person in 2018, just like everyone else. And when I was a person in 2015 and thought, should I write a biography of a Mughal king? The idea was suggested to me. It was so obvious to do Aurangzeb. For personal reasons, because I had been thinking about him for nearly a decade at that point in time, and yet I had written almost nothing on Aurangzeb. There's only 5 pages or so on him in Culture of Encounters, the first book. And then from a sort of broader perspective, I felt that there was a real gap between scholarly advances on Aurangzeb Alamgir and what everyday people had access to in South Asia and elsewhere. And so I thought, well, why not see if I can, make some small contribution to bridging that divide?
I mean, yeah, what you've said about how you were learning these languages and that's how you came your interest in in the Mughal courts and in Indian history in general. But a lot of people have had this idea that since you're a Western scholar, you probably don't speak Sanskrit, don't read the text, don't maybe know enough about the context, and that's something you've had to reiterate several times. Why do you think you've had to justify being a scholar of Indian history?
So I think that the charitable reading here is that I think that there is some misunderstanding. People look at me, they see a white American woman, that's all true, and they think, how could she possibly know Sanskrit? How could she possibly read Farsi? How could she possibly speak any Hindi or Urdu, right? And so I think that there are, for some people, it is an understandable sort of obvious challenge, right? Why would this sort of a person be able to do this? Yeah. For other people, I think that it's more insidious, and I think that they use the color of my skin and which passport I carry, and frankly, my gender, right? My sex, the fact that I'm a woman plays a huge role in this. Many of my colleagues are white Western men, and they do not face the same basic challenges about their sort of ability to read their research languages. And at the end of the day, I invite people to judge my scholarship, and I invite them to actually read it in order to do that. And if you read Culture of Encounters, it's impossible for anyone to write that book without access to the Sanskrit and Persian literary traditions.
Yeah. You were talking before about your book on Aurangzeb, and one of the things you've said before while talking about that book is that now when people look at that era in India, in Mughal history, in history of the subcontinent, they're looking at certain decisions that were probably politically motivated as more for theological reasons. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Maybe give us an example of what are these decisions, why you think they were political, and why you think that misinterpretation is happening?
So I think, people look at things like Aurangzeb reinstituted the jizya tax, right? A bigoted tax that targets Hindus, right? A prejudice tax in 1679. They look at the fact that he destroyed some Hindu temples, not the thousands people go on about today, but certainly some, right? A few dozen, perhaps. And they look at these things and they say, how do we explain it? Here's an anti-Hindu guy, right? This sort of anti-Hindu genocidal maniac who just wanted to sort of ground Hindus into the dirt of India, as it were. So the problem with that is it's bad history, and it's bad history because that causality doesn't come out of the Mughal context. It comes out of our modern context, and so we're sort of reading back in time. And also it doesn't allow us to make sense of other aspects of Aurangzeb's reign. And this is a sort of key point of historical method. People who read the past through the lens of politics can cherry pick evidence, but as a historian, I cannot do that, right? I have to take all of the evidence. And so, yes, Aurangzeb destroyed certain temples, but he protected more temples than he destroyed, right? And I can't make sense of those twinned facts using this assumption of a theological anti-Hindu bias motivation, right? It's true that he reinstituted the jizya. Upon ascending the throne, he also canceled several taxes on Hindu pilgrimage sites, and along with various other taxes. And so we have to make sense of those facts together, and what emerges is a more complex picture that is more honest to the past and draws upon the categories and ideas of Aurangzeb's time less than ours, and perhaps for that reason is not as satisfying to many popular readers.
One of the things, while you have these two books that we've been talking about and numerous articles to your name, you also talk about your work quite openly on social media, your insights and your articles, and you share them quite widely. Do you think that's important for academics today, particularly when they're talking about things that are relevant to politics, even if it's historical but relevant to discussions that are happening today?
So I think that it's a choice for academics, and it's a choice that I have made. And I make that choice because I want to engage publicly, and I don't want to cede the space of social media. I get a lot of pushback for doing this from my colleagues, and many of them think that, something as basic as the character limit on Twitter sort of flattens historical research, in historical arguments. I don't disagree with them. My argument is simply that, if you cede that territory, someone else is going to come along and talk about the past. And if historians have no presence and no voice, I think that that's a problem. I certainly don't think that it is incumbent upon other scholars to engage on social media, or even to engage with the public. I wish more scholars would do it, but I think everyone has to make that choice themselves. I would say that I get very fierce pushback for doing this, right? I'm trolled regularly, up to and including death and rape threats against me and against members of my family. And I think it's understandable why other scholars don't want to put themselves out there like that.
Speaking of this pushback, I think one of the things, at least I have noticed, is that you often take it on quite directly. You point it out, when there's a threat, you say, this is a threat, I have reported this, or often you even speak to them in a response. Why do you think that's important to do?
So, first I would say I only do this with a very small fraction of the hate mail that I receive. So why do I do it? I do it in part because I think that everyone should be forced to look at it, because I don't think that we should hide and just say, oh, well, this is just other people, this is just one part of India, right? This is a reality that has been brought to my doorstep that I have been forced to face. And I think that everyone else should look at it as well and take a good, hard look around and think, how did we get here and what can we do to stop it? The other reason that I do it is not to engage with the trolls, because you cannot reason with irrational people. I do it for the middle ground that's listening. And I think that often trolls will ask sorts of questions or make sorts of accusations that allow me to give an answer or make a point that I would like to make that someone in the middle would actually like to hear. They might have asked the question far more respectfully, right? But why not answer it, right? Why not speak to doubts that may sort of linger in people's minds? So that's really what I'm trying to accomplish when I talk back.
Speaking of this trip to India, we've been talking about your work and the kind of pushback you've received, and some people have decided that now this work is controversial. And recently you were supposed to speak at an event in Hyderabad, and that was cancelled last minute. And apparently because first there was some threats to the organizers about possible protests at the site. And Sorry. No, please.
No, I was gonna say, so my understanding is that there were not threats, there were protests, specifically letters of protest. I have only seen one such letter, but I do think that that is an important distinction.
Yeah,
There were no threats of violence. And so when the organizers are defending themselves saying, oh, we got threats, right, that is not true.
The pushback you receive on social media, do you think that self-censorship of academics is going to be a real threat here? And also, do you think that it's going to affect the kind of academic work that happens in and on India?
Absolutely, I think it already is.
Yeah.
So I have censored both of my books in the Indian editions, right? They are, both of them, the Indian editions are slightly different than the worldwide editions. And I know a lot of academics who choose their research projects differently. We openly advise students actually to do this in the United States, right? There are certain topics that it is just not worth it to work on because you won't get a visa to come to India. You know, if you have family here, there could be problems, right? You have to make these decisions in the real world with your eyes wide open. Many of my colleagues are declining to publish their books in India. Right? For those of us that live and work in the United States or elsewhere in the Western world, we need the publications there for career reasons. We don't need them here for career reasons. And so they're choosing to simply shrink the market of interested readers rather than risk problems. And I think that all of this is a problem because it means that the Indian people are not getting the full story. They don't have access to the same sort of scholarship that we do in the United States or the United Kingdom. And this is contributing to the sort of constriction of space and air all around us. And the list of topics that we can talk about seems to grow shorter every day.
And do you think this is something that is increasing? Is it something that's been happening for a while? Would you say it's recent?
I mean, certainly something like censorship of books. I mean, India's been banning books since the British were here. So that's not new in a sense. I think it is certainly accelerating. And that has to do with the BJP and with the Sangh Parivar and with the sort of rise of the Hindu right and the transition of Hindu nationalism from an extremist ideology to basically defining the mainstream of India right now.
This talk at Hyderabad that people didn't want you to give, could you tell us a little bit about what you were going to say?
So the title was Unpopular Stories. The protest, or threats of protest, as it were, I suppose, proved my point. And I was going to talk on three topics. I was going to talk about Aurangzeb, and specifically the assault on Golconda in the late 1680s. That was, sort of spatially appropriate to Hyderabad. I was then going to talk about the end of Indian Buddhism in the 12th century of the Common Era and the allegations that Islam was responsible for basically slaughtering the remaining Indian Buddhists. I have some quibbles with that storyline, and I've published an article on that subject. I was going to talk about that. And then the third and final unpopular story was going to be drawn from my ongoing research on Sanskrit sort of narratives of the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal periods, and sort of what Sanskrit intellectuals were saying about Muslim-led and Indo-Muslim rule in India.
Just that last point, in your talking about your future research, could you tell us a little bit more about it? What were they saying, and why do you think it's important for people in India today to read that? Do you think it could change our understanding of how historically different communities in India spoke of each other?
So I certainly think that it can do that, and I'm hopeful that it will. Yeah. So these texts I'm working on, they date from the late 12th to the early 18th century. They're all in Sanskrit, and they're all about Indo-Muslim rule or Muslim-led rule in some regard. Some of them are histories of cross-cultural encounters, and some are histories of extreme violence. And I think that, especially the histories of extreme violence, there's a real question there. When one side is slaughtering the other side, how do you use that to increase understanding today? And I think that one way you do that is by looking at the terms of otherness, right? When you have two sides meeting on a battlefield, there is no doubt that there is an us versus them. But who is the us and who is the them? And whereas today we talk about Hindu-Muslim conflict very freely and all the time, back then, people weren't talking about Hindus in Sanskrit, right? Hindu is not even a Sanskrit word, doesn't enter Sanskrit till a bit later. And people weren't talking about Muslims either, right? So they were identifying themselves differently. And that's sort of one thing I want to focus on in this project. What were the terms of that difference, and how can that sort of unsettle and even displace our easy assumption of the primacy of religious identity now?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Janami. My pleasure.
Pleasure to speak to you.
You as well.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.